your market as well as your marketplace. Now the next issue that I wanted us to look at is the concepts. The concepts will be defined throughout our presentation. Now markets are divided into two, which are your perfect market and your imperfect market. Now as a learner, you should not confuse these markets with the markets which were discussed in paper 1. Now I just want to repeat that markets in this case are divided into your perfect market as well as your imperfect market. Now the next issue that I want us to look at is what are the functions of these markets. The first function, it is that markets are responsible for allocating resources. And the second function here, it is markets are responsible for bringing buyers and sellers together and also allow prices as well as quantity of goods and services to be negotiated. Now these are three most important or main functions of markets. Now we move on to what is termed a market structure. Now immediately when you look at a market structure, a definition of a market structure is it is different forms and levels of a competition. Different forms and levels of competition. That is a market structure. Now the next issue that I want us to note here is that your market structures are divided into your perfect market, your monopoly, your oligopoly, as well as your monopolistic competition. Now the next issue that I wanted us to look at when you discuss about markets is that your market structure being divided into your perfect market, monopoly, oligopoly, as well as your monopolistic competition. You must also know that you have what is called an imperfect market. Now an imperfect market, you have, in this case now, you have your monopoly, your oligopoly, as well as your monopolistic competition. Now in Fazilet Dabi district, your teachers will always refer to these market structures as using the acronym PMAM, P standing for your perfect market, monopoly, oligopoly, as well as your monopolistic competition. While your imperfect market structure, they refer it as your MAM, which is your monopoly, your oligopoly, as well as your monopolistic competition. Now when we come to an individual seller and industry, you also have to explain what is a perfect market. Now a perfect market will only exist when there is a perfect competition. A perfect market will only exist when there is a perfect competition. And then a perfect competition will then be defined as a situation where there are many buyers and sellers in the market. Now let us look at our two important graphs here, which is your individual seller as well as your industry. Now I want us for you to do what for us? You draw your individual seller plus your industry. Now, what is the difference between the two graphs here? The first thing that we need to define here, it is what is an industry. An industry, it is a number of firms selling similar product or offering the same service. For an example, you will hear that people talking about a taxi industry or the music industry. That is what is called an industry. Now, in drawing your graphs, I just want us, grade 12s, to know the following. That, number one, always label your graph, name your graph first, and then you mention on the vertical side as well as on the horizontal side. You have to label those two axes, the vertical side as well as the horizontal side. Now, in the industry, you have your downward sloping demand curve as well as your upward sloping supply curve. Now, where the two curves intersect, we call that particular point the market equilibrium point. The market equilibrium point. Now, that is what is happening in what? In the industry. Now, you also have an individual seller. Now, an individual seller can also be referred to as your individual producer. That is one and the same term. Now, your individual seller, regardless of the number of outputs produced, the price will remain the same. Regardless of the number of outputs produced, the price will remain the same. Now, on the horizontal line of your individual seller, you have your marginal revenue equals to your average revenue equals to your demand curve. In other words, once you look at the two graphs, your individual seller demand curve as well as your industry demand curve, you will realize that there are two different graphs. Another one, it is horizontal. Another one, it is a downward sloping curve. Now, immediately the question here will then arise to say why an individual seller is faced with a horizontal demand curve. Now, your individual seller is faced with a horizontal demand curve because they sell the same products, which means that the products are homogeneous. And secondly, in this case, you have that the individual seller is said to be a price taker. Now, looking at the two graphs here, your individual seller cannot sell above your market equilibrium price. Now, why is a question. Why an individual seller cannot sell above your market equilibrium point? Now, the reason is one cannot buy similar products at a higher price while one can easily get the same product somewhere else at a cheaper price. Now, the second issue is that an individual seller cannot sell below your market equilibrium price. Now, the question here will then be why? It is because at the market equilibrium point, it is whereby your individual seller is going to maximize his or her profits. Now, once an individual seller decides to sell below your market equilibrium price, that individual seller or producer will faced with a loss, ultimately leading to a shutdown of his or her business. Right. Now, that is what is happening in terms of your individual seller as well as your industry graphs. Now, the second topic that I want us to quickly look at, it is the characteristics of your perfect market. The characteristics of a perfect market. Now, in discussing these characteristics, you need to put the criteria forward. Now the first one here, it is the number of firms. You can either say the number of firms or the number of businesses. Now in this case, in a perfect market, there are many buyers and sellers in the market. That is the first one. The second one, it is the type of the product, or you can easily say the nature of the product. Now a perfect market is faced with a homogeneous products. Now a homogeneous product in this case will refer to being identical or being the same. Now the next issue that I want us to note here is, once you talk about a homogeneous product, you can make an example of a producer or a seller selling eggs. The eggs will be the same in terms of quality, in terms of design. These are homogeneous products. The next one, it is market entry. Market entry. You can say the market entry or barriers to entry. Now, a perfect market, it is actually faced with no laws, no permits or regulation. You can easily enter or leave the market easily. The next characteristics, it is control over price. Now in a perfect market, the perfect market or a perfect competitor, you have what? You have none. They do not have a control over price. Now the question here is why. Remember, when we discussed about an individual seller as well as industry, we said that your individual seller is influenced by the market equilibrium, the price. Now you have your demand curve. Your demand curve in a perfect market, it is horizontal demand curve. Now the next characteristic, it is information. The information in this case, it is complete. In other words, both the buyer and the seller have a perfect knowledge of different prices of the same product in the same market. Now the next characteristic, it is a long-term economic profit. Now in this case, your perfect market, it is faced with a normal profit in the long term. Right. And the next one, as one of the characteristics there, it is said that your perfect market, they are what? They are the price takers. And one of the characteristics again is that there is no government intervention in this market. Now, and also the buyers and sellers, they act independently as one of the characteristics. Now remember, you should be able to discuss these characteristics based on the specified criteria. The next issue that I want us to look at, it is your outputs, your profits, your losses, as well as your supply. Now, in this case, it is important that you should know that you have what is called a short-run equilibrium position under a perfect competition. Now, I just want you, the grade 12 learners, to know that for this one, you need to draw the 3 different graphs so that you may be able to understand or differentiate between these 3 different graphs. Now, your first graph would be your normal profit. The second graph here would be your economic loss, and your next graph would be your economic profit, which is also known as a supernormal profit. Now, in drawing these graphs, we follow the same procedure. We name the graph first, and then we go on to name your axis secondly, and then you name your cost and your revenue curves. Now, our first graph, it is your normal profit. Now, in your normal profit, you will realize that the same, you have your marginal cost curve shaped as your tick, or sometimes most of our learners will refer to as the Nike logo. And then you have your horizontal line where your marginal revenue is equal to average revenue is equal to your demand curve. Now, always remember, once you draw this graph, you must indicate the profit maximization point. Profit maximization point. And then now, this point, the profit maximization point, it is a point where your marginal cost is equal to your marginal revenue. Now, in your discussion of your normal profit, we say that the lowest point of AC is tangent to your AR MC curves. And then at point E, it is a point where your total revenue is equal to your total cost, or your marginal revenue is equal to your marginal cost. Now, at this point, the business, it is not making a profit, and also it is not making a loss. And this point, it is called the break-even point, where the business, it is not making a profit or a loss. It is called the break-even point. And also remember, a normal profit by definition, it is that type of a profit or earnings that keeps an entrepreneur from not leaving the industry or the market. The second graph here, you have your economic loss graph. The same procedure should be followed exactly, whereby the first thing, you should be able to name your graph and label your axis correctly. On your vertical side, you have price, and then on your horizontal side, you have your quantity, which is also known as your output. And then you also have your horizontal line, where your MR is equal to your AR is equal to D. And then you have your marginal cost curve. And then in this case, you also have to label point E, which is where your marginal cost would be equal to your marginal revenue. Now, your average cost curve would be above your marginal revenue is equal to your average revenue is equal to your demand curve. Now, when you discuss this curve or graph, you should know the following. Number one, at point E, it is where your marginal revenue is equal to your marginal cost. Now, from that point, you go above that particular point, and just below your average cost curve, you go to your left, and it is where you find your economic loss. Now it is important also to write inside that particular box that these individual producer is faced with your economic loss. Now, and also it is important that you should also label that particular box. Maybe you can easily say P, P1, A, and E to make sure that you actually note that the individual seller it is actually faced with economic loss. The last one, it is your economic profit. The same procedure, it is going to be followed. You label your graph first, which is in this case your economic profit. Sometimes your economic profit, it is also known as your supernormal profit. Now, on your vertical axis, you have price, and then on your horizontal axis, you have quantity. Now, in this case, you have also your horizontal line, where your MR is equal to AR is equal to D. And then you have your marginal cost curve, marginal cost, and then your average cost curve would be below your marginal revenue. And remember, at the point where your marginal revenue is equal to your marginal cost, you label it and you put your E, or you can use any other symbol just to indicate that it is your equilibrium point. Now, the second issue that I want us to note here is, in your examination questions, you might also be given a question to say, what does the above graph depicts? How are you going to know that this is an imperfect market, perfect market, monopoly economic loss, as well as monopolistic competition? You will look at the graph. Once there is a horizontal line where your marginal revenue is equal to your average revenue is equal to your demand curve, then you know that in this case we are referring to a perfect competition. Now the difference here would be either this is a normal profit, economic profit, as well as economic loss. Now that is concerning all the graphs. Now, one other question that you'll always remember here is, as one of the question is, why the slope of AC curve shaped like that? Now, AC curve will be shaped like that because of the two different scenarios here. It is going to be faced by economies of scale at a particular point, and then it will rise because of these economies of scale. Now, when you look at your marginal cost curve, it will go down slightly, and it will go up like that. Now, the question is, why it is shaped like that? It is shaped like that because your cost of a business will actually decrease as the number of output produced up to a particular point. But then now, once you increase your output, your cost will also increase. The next issue that I want us to look at is, how do we then get a profit or a loss from these different graphs? Now, it is important to note the following, that your profit, it is equal to price multiplied by quantity. Or you can use the equation, profit is equal to your total revenue minus your total cost, or your profit is equals to your average revenue minus your average cost multiplied by quantity. Or you can use what is called the unit loss or unit profit equations. For an example, if you take your normal profit, if on the horizontal side, in fact on the vertical side we have a price of 20 and then a quantity of 10, then we are going to say profit is equals to price multiplied by quantity, which is in this case 20 representing price and 10 representing quantity, which is equals to your 200. In this case, your profit would be 200. Remember that we refer to quantity as output because by definition, an output, it is a quantity of units produced. An output, it is quantity of units produced. Now, before we can go on to the next one, I just wanted us to repeat the following equations. Once you calculate from your graphs, you have profit equals to price multiplied by quantity, or your profit is equals to your total revenue minus your total cost, or profit is equals to your average revenue minus average cost multiplied by quantity, or you can use also your unit loss or your unit profit. Now, the most important thing here that our learners should be able to understand is that the following: your marginal cost curve must always cut your average cost curve at its minimum point. When you draw these graphs, your marginal cost curve must always cut your average cost curve at its minimum. The second issue that I wanted us to note and understand when you draw these graphs, once you get one graph incorrect, say for instance, instead of writing MC, you write AC, and then the entire discussion of your graph will not be correct. That's one important point that you should always remember, apart from maybe writing MC and getting your MR correct, where you are going to say your MR is equal to your MC, which is your profit maximization point. Right.
You are listening to Citibank FM 104.8. Excellence guaranteed.
Valve number one radio station, Citibank FM 104.8. Valve number one radio station.
The Free State Department of Education, Fezile Dabi District, brings you the COVID-19 Matric radio program through Hope FM and Citibank FM from 10 in the morning to 12 midday and from 5 p.m. till 7 p.m. every day. If you are doing grade 12, do join us. Or if you are a parent, get your child to listen, to ask your questions and get clarity on different subjects. Send us your WhatsApp messages or voice notes on 072-839-0427, or you can also follow us on Twitter at MEC Tate Mahwe. Free State Department of Education, raising the bar, closing the gap, and supporting learners in all grades.
Have you heard about the coronavirus 2019?
Now, the next topic, it is about the long-run equilibrium output level of a perfect market. Now, remember, in this case, you draw first your first horizontal line, where your MR is equal to your AR is equal to your demand curve. And then slightly to your left, you are going to include the following curves. You are going to include your marginal cost and your average cost. And then in this P1, which is price number 1, an individual seller is enjoying economic profits in a short run. Now, because of these economic profits that individual seller is enjoying, these will attract new entrants into the business. And once there are new entrants into the business, that will push our prices to P2. Now, that is our second horizontal line, where your MR is equal to AR is equal to your demand curve, and also include your marginal cost as well as your average cost. In this case, we are referring to this graph as your normal profit. In other words, in a short run, your individual seller in a perfect market will enjoy economic profit. Because of these, new entrants will like also to be part of these activities of enjoying economic profit. By doing so, they will push prices downwards to P2, whereby in this case, your perfect competitor will enjoy just your normal profit. That is a long run equilibrium position. Now remember, in this case, we are referring to short run as well as long run, which is different from short term and long term. In this case, I just wanted us to look at the following terms because these are completely two different terms. Your long run, it is not your short, it is not your long term. And your short run, it is not your short term. Now, the next issue that I want us to look at, it is your total revenue versus your total cost curves. Now, as your output increases, as your total output increases, your total revenue will increase as output increases. Therefore, in this case, your total revenue curve will have a slope, a positive slope. It will move from 0 upwards, while your total cost curve will form a shape of an S. Now, where total costs, the difference between in that graph, the difference between your total cost and your total revenue, it is your profit maximization point. Right. Now, the longest line between your TR and your TC is where the profit is maximized. In what? Where your total revenue versus your total cost curve. Now, the next issue that I want us to note is that from these questions, learners will be able to understand the following points. Now, the first one is they must be able to note the break-even point from the table. Now, the break table, if a learner is given a table, it is where your total revenue equals to your total cost. But then now, the slight problem here is that not always in the table, your total revenue will always equals to your total cost exactly. In this case, we say once we have a scenario like that, Then you are going to say where your total revenue is slightly higher than your TC. It is your point of break-even point. When your TC is slightly higher than your TC, it is whereby you are going to have your break-even point from the table if you are given the table. Now the next issue or graph, it is about your shutdown graph. Now your shutdown graph here, you have your first line, your horizontal line. Always remember when you draw your graphs, you have to name it first, and then you label the sides, your vertical side, your price, your horizontal side, your quantity, and then your marginal cost. Your first line of a horizontal demand curve, it is where you have your MR is equal to your AR is equal to D. Your second one, it is where your MR is equal to your AR is equal to D. Now, the first one graph, you have where your MC intersect your MC curve. The second one is where you cut your ABC curve. Now you lay that point, those points where your MC cuts your MR. The first one you have E, which is your first equilibrium position. The second intersection, it is E2, where MR is equal to ABC, which is also known as your shutdown curve. Now, what are the possible questions that you must always remember when we talk about a shutdown? At the point where your MC is equal to your ABC curve, it is not an indication of that the business must actually close down. It is just an indication that if we continue producing below this point, the business must actually close down. Below your shutdown curve, it is whereby the business will then have to close down at that particular point, below that particular point. Now, from a point of shutdown upwards, now the individual seller, that graph, it is known as your supply curve. Above shutdown curve, your MC curve will then be said to be what? Will then be said to be your supply curve. The next issue that I want us to quickly look at, it is what are possible questions from the perfect market. The first question that I want us to look at here is that why are businesses under a perfect market structure price takers? We talked about that. It is because they are influenced by forces of demand and supply, or they are price takers, or they sell homogeneous products. The second question that I want us to look at, it is where does the marginal cost curve intersect the average cost curve? Now remember, we said your MC must always cut your AC at the lowest point. The next question is, which point indicates profit maximization? Which point indicates profit maximization? Now, for you to be able to know that point, you look at where your marginal revenue curve is equal to your marginal cost curve, which is where your MC is equal to your MR. The second one is, which curve represents the market price for the perfect competitor? Now the answer for that question is, it is where AR is equal to MR is equal to D. Now, the second question that you should always remember when we talk about a perfect market is, how is price determined in a perfect market? Now, the price is determined by the intersection of demand and supply, or it is where a demand is equal to supply curve. Now, quickly before we conclude the topic of the day, I just want us to go back a little bit and summarize your perfect market. What is the easiest way of summarizing this particular topic? The first thing, it is you need also to know that there are two types of markets, which is perfect and imperfect market. And also, the second issue that you should know is that the market structure is divided into a perfect market, monopoly, oligopoly, as well as a monopolistic competition. Now, remember the usage of different terms. If we talk about the producers, we are also equally saying we are talking about the sellers. If we talk about the consumers, we are also referring to that particular term as buyers. Now, if we refer to a perfect market, it is also known as a perfect competitor. The next issue that you should always remember, it is your characteristics of your perfect market using what? Using the criteria that I have mentioned earlier on. The next issue that I want us to note here, in a perfect market, it is short-run equilibrium positions under a perfect competition. Now, this question is a typical essay question, whereby in this case, learners should be able to know how to draw the graphs correctly, also how to discuss these graphs, and also they should be able to compare these different types of profits or a loss looking from the graphs. The next issue that I wanted us to look at, it is your calculations from your graphs, which is one other area which is also important. But for you to be able to calculate correctly, you need to know your equations. The next issue that I wanted us to look at, it is your shutdown curve, where when you look at your of our learners do make a mistake at the point of shutdown, because they will refer to that point as a point where the business must close down. Now, that point of shutdown, it is not a point where the business must close down. It is an indication that the business, once the business is selling below that particular point, the business must close down. It must close its operations. Now, the next issue that I wanted us to look at, it is your question paper. Your question paper, quickly. Now, your microeconomics questions will always appear in question 2 plus a combination in question 4 as well as in question 5. Now, how are you going to tackle these questions, particularly the essays, in this particular market? Number 1, in the essays, you must know the characteristics of a perfect market. And then the second one, with the aid of graphs, discuss short-run equilibrium positions perfect market. And lastly, learners should be able to compare these market structures, be able to compare your perfect market with oligopoly, monopoly, or with monopolistic competition. They can compare these using what? Using graphs or using specific criteria. Using specific criteria. Right.
Okay, mamedi motle wa Sedibeng FM ntate Metsing. Hey, re le bile haholo wena ngwaneso. Re le bile haholo wena ngwaneso.
Re le bile haholo mme wa ka.
Re tla be re kopana hape.
Re tlo kopana mme wa ka. Beke tse tlang.
Oh, beke tse tlang
re le ka kwano hape. Ntse re sebetsana le tsona di market.
All right. A ke le bile.
Re le bile haholo. Re la ka letsa bana ba grade 12 ba 2020 selemo se monate re tshepa lo dumela hore ba tla sebetsa hantle selemo se fela le rona